famous British philosopher Bertrand Russell states, "The more intense has been the religion of any period, and the more profound has been the dogmatic belief, the greater has been the cruelty, and the worse has been the state of affairs." Albert Einstein, scientist, states, "I cannot imagine a God who rewards and punishes the objects of his creation, whose purposes are modeled after our own. A God, in short, who is but a reflection of human frailty. Neither can I believe that the individual survives the death of his body, although feeble souls harbor such thoughts through fear or ridiculous egotism."
Hello, and welcome again to Atheists of Florida Forum. I'm Dr. Albert Lingz-Idison, your host, moderator, and occasional devil's advocate. Today we have a special show for you. We're going to explore the ramifications, the meaning, and the consequences of the psychology of faith. And our guests today include Dr. Mano Daniel, philosophy professor, Nan Owens, who I understand is principal professional resources, welcome, and Dr. John Xantopoulos from Social Science Department, FAU. Welcome all. Well, perhaps to get us started, I'd like to make a few clarifications and a few introductory remarks. People often argue that one cannot justify religious belief based upon argumentation, rhetoric, or logic, or even rationality. However, that's perfectly fine. We can still do so based upon faith. And so what we're going to ask today is, what does the term faith really mean? For some people, faith means to have a deep and abiding trust in something. Others, by faith, I guess, could mean nothing more than a hope or a fervent wish that something be true, even though there might be little or no evidence for it. And yet other people, by faith, could mean nothing more than a hunch or perhaps a gut reaction. William James, in his landmark essay called The Will to Believe, argued that in cases of what he called genuine options, one's passionate nature must make a decision, and perhaps this might be a panic reaction. So to get us started today, we are hoping that Mr. or Dr. Mano Daniel can give us some clarification as what is usually meant in religious rhetoric when we say, I have a belief based upon faith and I need no rational proof that faith is sufficient for me.
Let me start with the distinction you started with. I mean, sometimes faith is to take a very practical attitude. I have faith in you as a friend, which is I trust you. And so sometimes when you talk about faith, you're talking about a trust in God. In modern parlance, we tend to think of faith more in epistemological terms, in terms of evidence for knowledge claims. So when you talk about faith, it is to take a claim as true, to believe something to be true on cognitive grounds. Just to add to that a little bit, a statement believed in faith is often taken to be less certain than something based on knowledge, but somehow more veridical than something that is just a matter of opinion. To believe in something, to have faith in it, is to at times have some evidence, whatever that evidence is, that removes that statement from just pure opinion.
Okay. Well, Nan, I understand you had some experience in fundamentalist religion and some seminary training or theological training, as the case may be. What was usually meant within a congregation or a church when people called, what do they mean by faith? When they said they had a strong faith, for example, in Christ, or they had a faith in their God. Is it something akin to what Mano was elucidating on?
Well, actually, you're probably speaking of faith in the general sense of interpersonal relations.
Mm-hmm.
To look at the Christian Bible, it actually defines faith in there in the book of Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So it is definitely a more ephemeral type of situation than interpersonal relationships. And there is actually a pride in the idea that this is not proven, this is not supported by anything in this world. It is a heavenly thing. It must be believed through faith, without evidence, in the heart.
Could it be argued that perhaps the more evidence there is against what a person believes in, yet they still choose to believe or wills to believe, the stronger is their faith.
Yes, definitely.
I guess perhaps a good example of that is the philosopher Kierkegaard talks about this in a book called Fear and Trembling, as how Abraham, was it, I believe, was confronted by a dilemma. God ordered Abraham to sacrifice his own son. And this went against all rational belief, even his own ethical code of what was right. And yet he chose to have, quote-unquote, faith in God and go against everything else he had ever believed in. And we hold up such people as paragons of faith. John, you seem to have something to say on that point.
Nothing to say about this, specifically about Abraham, except, of course, the only thing I can say from a political science perspective is that faith, blind faith, has caused and is causing a tremendous amount of problems in our world.
Well, on that note, I think it's interesting to point out that oftentimes we admire people who have strong faith, who are willing to go against the grain, to be nonconformists, Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ, etc. So this is oftentimes very impressive to us. But of course, if we turn the tables a bit, one man's or woman's strong person of faith is another person's zealot or terrorist.
But to go back to a point you made earlier about Kierkegaard, which is that, and that brings in the notion of choice. Lacking evidence or conclusive scientific evidence, one, for Kierkegaard and for many Christians, I would take it, is to choose to believe. It is a voluntary assumption of certain propositions. And in that sense, perhaps, when Kierkegaard talks about taking a leap of faith, he is emphasizing the voluntary nature of that, as opposed to the dogmatic nature of blind trust.
Well, I'm not sure if I know that Kierkegaard says that, but from me, it seems that that's not always the case. I've talked to some fundamentalist Christians. I asked them, what made you accept Christ? And I precisely asked the Kierkegaardian question, was it a voluntary choice you made? And their argument was, no, it was almost as they were sucked up into something, brought in or absorbed. And it was either gradual or abrupt, but in any case, it was not totally voluntary. Nan, did you have any experience with that, or knew people who would argue that I didn't choose to accept Christ, I didn't decide to, it simply just happened to me. I had this faith enveloped me, for instance.
Many fundamentalist Christians will say that, it was something inside of them that did it. Others will say even that it was God's choosing, that they believe, that God chooses who will and who won't believe even. Looking at Kierkegaard, where he's talking about choice and that, you're talking about getting amongst people who are thinking and reading and that. To tell you the truth, I think that for most of the populace, faith is a substitute for thinking. People don't want to spend the time to really think things out, and it's just easier to go with what they're hearing.
Oh, I agree with Nan totally. And what's causing things like in Yugoslavia, for example, is people not thinking. Precisely, if they thought, they would be doing, heinous murders left, right, and center. So I agree with you. It substitutes thinking.
Well, to further amplify on that point, and I made a point just a minute ago, we have to perhaps focus on dogmatic faith. The dogmatic person is the one that says, I am so certain of the truth of this proposition that I need not even consider any possible putative counter-evidence, because since this is bound to be a true proposition, any counter-evidence is false, why waste my time? Rationally speaking, this is a good claim. I mean, if something is indeed true, why should I waste my time? Of course, the problem is, how do they know that it's true? And this is where, exactly John's point is that if, in fact, you have a dogmatic faith, any kind of argumentation or persuasiveness is utterly and totally pointless. You're wasting your time.
In that respect, was Lenin correct? It is the opium of the people.
Indeed. Well, to pick up on that point further, Mano, I'm going to return to you. Earlier we were discussing that indeed, in some cases, you have a voluntary decision. I'm going to choose to believe so-and-so. A student of mine pointed out to me that there's something interesting going on here. If we look at this on pragmatic grounds, the atheists and the theists have very different priorities about the consequences of their belief. For instance, the theist chooses to believe what they believe, perhaps because they feel it important to have a sense of security about their world, to have a sense of hope for an afterlife, to have a sense of a relatedness to the eternal or the ultimate. And these are important for them, for their own sense of well-being. So it's the consequences of faith-based belief that they're looking at. The atheist, conversely, is saying, this isn't important to me. What's important for me is the consequences of a belief that promotes self-reliance, autonomy, independent thought, etc. Now, of course, the question I guess we would ask is, why is it that to some individuals it's the consequences of faith that are important, whereas for other individuals it's the consequences of a skeptical or at least somewhat cautious atheism that seem to be important?
Well, faith, again, I mean, to go back to what I was talking about earlier, in terms of the cognitive value we placed on faith, to have faith in a non-atheist, in an atheistic position, is not necessarily to give up on all kinds of evidence. I mean, we believe in a lot of things on insufficient evidence, but we have fairly good claims for believing it. As contrasted to a sort of a dogmatic faith, where I do not really want to look too closely at my beliefs, because if I do, I might find holes in them. And so then I say, no, I believe in faith, and I do not wish to scrutinize my beliefs. Faith then becomes a subterfuge for that. In that subterfuge, hey, lots of things, as long as we don't know about them, they're pretty good.
Well, I guess we're saying
I wouldn't want to
bliss.
advocate that position, but for a lot of people, that seems a comforting thought.
Well, along those lines, I think one other point I was going to make is that Alvin Plantinga, who's a famous, or at least fairly well-known philosopher of religion, has pointed out that when a person has faith and they say they believe in God, that claim entails much more than I believe in God. It entails a certain outlook about the way the world is, about the way morality is, about the way they are related to all of this. So it's too simplistic to say that a person having faith is merely a belief in a simple proposition. This proposition is intricately interconnected with many other propositions. So if a person says, I have faith, it tells you a lot about their character and their personality and the kind of person they are.
It does. Don't forget that Oliver North.
Excuse me?
Oliver North was elected, not elected, but he represents the Republican Party in Virginia. And I believe in God, and I'm going to show you what I really mean about my belief in God. Well, family values and the whole agenda.
Well, that's what I think that I'd like to focus on a little bit, is that indeed to say I have faith usually tells a rather large story, as opposed to just saying I simply believe in God.
An entire social agenda, an entire economic agenda, an entire political agenda. The entire social sciences, astronomy, anthropology, paleontology. You mentioned a book not about half an hour ago about the dinosaurs and Reverend Kennedy. I mean, the entire social sciences agenda.
Well, Nan, if I can get back to you, why is it that some people find this more important than others to have this faith?
For the majority of people, I think they want a sense of closure, of certainty. And you'll find that the people who have this kind of strong faith, and like you said, it is more than just believing in God.
Right.
It's being able to have right in your hands here the truths about your life and your world. You know, it's not out there. If you look at even at these people in a situation of, say, like a current dilemma, a certain issue that is before the country, they'll have a strong opinion on it. There's a strength in that, rather than the person who is looking at that issue and says, well, yeah, I can see this is a real problem, and, you know, here's some things on this side that are very important, but on the other hand, there's also this, and you don't come up with a simple answer. So there is this strength in closure and in knowing where you are and having it right there.
Well, approaching that from another angle, would it be fair to say that the person to whom faith is important is a person who's distinctly uncomfortable with ambiguity and the messiness of the world, with the uncertainty? And so it's very important for them to feel secure that at least they think they know something.
Right.
Whereas the atheistic individual in many cases will be the one who says, well, the world is cruel and unkind and there's no real reason for it, it makes no sense, and I'm capable of handling that. I don't need to, as they say, have this opium in order to subdue
Or he may be incapable of handling it, but he still has to deal with his self-doubt and the fact that there's no conclusive evidence. The religious person that has faith, in some sense, is appealing not just to belief in God, but to God's authority. God has authorized this set of practices. He guarantees that this is true. But that is, one, in some sense, to renege on your the necessary function of looking at the evidence, and to precluding any counter evidence, because if God guarantees it, then there's no point to
even considering it. Sure.
Yeah.
Nan, you were going to say.
Well, you were talking earlier about the different point of view between, say, a theist and an atheist, and you were saying that an atheist has a different point of view. And very often it's not necessarily that they first of all were looking at that point of view. Many atheists, of course, at one time were theists, and they weren't necessarily looking for something different, but as they would encounter what appeared to be evidence and truth, they could not turn away from that, and so had to reorient themselves.
Oftentimes I think it's well the case that some atheists say, well, I wish I could believe this.
Exactly.
But I just can't make myself, believe that any more than I can make myself believe that, there's a leprechauns or whatnot. But there's two other things I wanted to address. One is this. Why is it that even though sometimes people profess to have a strong faith, which is fine, why is it so important to them to impress that faith upon us? I'll give you an example. I have a strong faith that it will probably rain at least 1 or 2 days in the next few. This is Florida, it's summer, it's going to rain. I base that strong faith upon the conviction that in the past it's been my experience that it rains. And if you don't believe me, I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. But this is not so with the religious individual, is it?
No, and for the religious individual, remember, there is scientific knowledge that we can know, but that's in this realm. We can see it, we can measure it, etc. And for the religious person, he wants to claim that there are things about human affairs that are outside this realm. Important things for him, God, freedom, etc. And he wants to impress you that these things are important, and that's why he's going to say you must have faith, because scientific knowledge is only going to get you so far. That's his claim.
Okay.
Now, again, back in the social agenda and political agenda,
That's right.
fundamental Muslims are willing to die in order to save you and guarantee themselves passage to heaven.
Well,
as in Beirut, for example, and so many other examples.
I think that that's very true. And in many cases, I guess, especially in Western religion, you have the case that part of the superstructure of the religion is proselytization, a jihad, or whatnot. But furthermore, I often give the following example in my classroom. I say, there's a little boy, and he's approaching a cemetery near midnight on Friday the 13th. It's a cold October day. And the closer this child gets to the cemetery, the more loudly he whistles. And why does he do this, right? Well, he's trying to convince himself that he's not afraid, right? And I argue that in many cases, the person who claims to profess a strong faith, it's not as strong as we think. They themselves have certain doubts in the back of their head. Is this really true? Now, they're confronted with the atheist, who seems to be a fairly intelligent person, as knowledgeable as they, if not more so perhaps. This is very threatening, because here's somebody like me, at least on my level, and they don't accept any of this. It's sort of like going to a bar with an alcoholic. They offer to buy you a drink, and you politely say no thanks. They think it's an indictment of their character, right? And you might just not want to have a drink, not on moral grounds, you just don't like the taste of alcohol. But they will find this terribly offensive, because it somehow makes them feel profoundly uncomfortable about their drinking habit. In the same way, I argue that in some cases where people proclaim to have faith, what they have is perhaps a belief which they're not entirely sure of. In order to shore that belief up, they have to bring you into the fold. And now, if they can bring you in, it makes them feel more comfortable and secure.
Because you threaten their worldview. You
Exactly.
threaten that security that comes from this abdication of
I think clinical psychology has to come into play right now.
Well, that's what I'm looking at, is psychology.
It is, right.
Well, the last, perhaps, point to analyze a little bit is this. We have been brought up in a society where if somebody says, I believe this based upon faith, it's almost like a red light goes off and says, don't question any further. It's disrespectful. And I would like to forward the contention that this is very dangerous. because what it does is it stifles any kind of intelligent reflection or speculation or analysis, because what we've been brought up to believe is that out of respect, we should not question somebody's faith. And if we think about this, isn't this very pernicious? Because somebody says, I believe this on faith, we back off. Now, if I said to somebody, I believe upon faith, for instance, that the sky is green, they wouldn't think that's a very respectable position at all. But if I said, I believe upon faith that Jesus Christ is my Lord, all of a sudden, everybody retreats. And so what I'd like to look at this is, should we be respectful, or as respectful as we are, when somebody says, I believe this upon faith? Any mano?
I take it there's some decent people out there who use the word faith in a reflective sort of way. And it wouldn't bother me if a scientist said he had faith in his research, if he meant by that it was a reflective, ongoing process. But yes, of course, to a large extent, faith is just to stop. Don't ask me anything, and I just believe that.
Well, I think it sort of echoes the previous point we made, that it sort of covers up a person's own fears and insecurities, and this is a very effective mechanism to short-circuit any further debate, because I'm not comfortable with this.
I think, of course, that as reflective citizens, we ought to question authority. And that is very much an American quote-unquote thing. You know, versus the 19th century Europe, even early 20th century Europe, where church and the imperial regimes, don't forget the Pope or the Patriarch, anointed the king and the emperor by the grace of God, the anointed of. So therefore, it was a very wonderful political maneuver. You don't question authority because one represents secular authority coupled with a divine authority in the presence of the Pope, the Archbishop, and the Bishop. So that is a wonderful patriarchal approach to stifling people in a non-democratic society.
Well, on those lines, I think it's interesting to point out also that with the term faith, what you get into is, in many religions, the person who claims to have faith is nothing more than somebody who strongly supports the political system.
Control.
And now you have the further agenda that, well, don't ask me no questions, I'll tell you no lies, or just don't want to even speak about it, and you have a very effective control mechanism. Now, where, John, do you see this most taking place in the world today? Is there a specific country? I would guess Islam would be a good start to consider.
Well, Islam would be a very, very good start. Islamic fundamentalism, the monarchies of Saudi Arabia, for example, Morocco, Jordan, and the dictators of the Middle Eastern nations use religion the exact same way the Russian Tsars did, the Roman emperors did, the entire Western development. They take it upon themselves, they camouflage it, and they combine secular and religious in order to stifle the people and to increase their power. In North Korea, of course, it's not the case, but they use now the atom bomb instead of religion.
Well, to focus on this once more on the individual level, is it true that people find faith to be a deeply personal experience? And I would think it is so in many cases. So what we need to ask ourselves is perhaps this: when somebody says, I don't want to talk about this. I have a friend of mine, for example, he says that a man's or a woman's faith is a much more private and intimate matter than their own sexuality. Now, that's a good analogy. Why is it that you're uncomfortable speaking about your faith sometimes? If it's more fundamentally uncomfortable than your own sexuality, is it because you're embarrassed? Or is it because talking about your faith somehow makes you feel that you are speaking as some kind of deviant or unacceptable person? Or is it perhaps that the experience of faith for some people is so amorphous that they simply cannot describe it in words? Or are all these things going on, perhaps?
Listen, I think that society, 20th, 21st century, is beginning to see or understand that sexuality in all of its human equations is normal. And we're beginning to see and hopefully realize that religion is not a normal human preoccupation. In other words, to believe in something that you actually cannot substantiate, you cannot see, you cannot talk to, it's not the same equation as human sexuality. We're all sexual beings, no matter what the equation might be for the human being. And I think society understands that. Religion and believing to something that is unknown, unseen, unspoken too, I think we begin to realize that yes, we can believe in anything you want to, but if you bring it up to the fore, how many people are comfortable in discussing something that they cannot touch, see, or speak to in person versus sexuality?
And then if you could perhaps elaborate on it in your experience, why are people often profoundly uncomfortable in discussing their faith? Even amongst believers, I would think. I can see, for example, a deeply religious person being uncomfortable discussing their faith with me if they know I'm chairman of Atheists of Florida, because they think it's adversarial. But even if amongst believers, it seems sometimes there's a profound discomfort in discussing one's faith. Is there any reason you think for that?
Most believers don't really know what all they believe. They know they believe in a God, and they know that they believe in, because this is America, we'll say the Christian church, whichever one it is. And so many of the things that they've been taught by their church is wound into our everyday life here. They don't know how to separate them. You know, they're confusing morality and religion. They get all of these slogans and catchwords from the political pundits out there. So they're getting this barrage of things that they're reacting to emotionally, viscerally. And so a lot of them don't really know what they believe.
Well, on that note, I'd like to point out that you led me right into my concluding comment. Baron Helvetius Holbach pointed out in an article he wrote, our incoherent idea of an imaginary God, that oftentimes the believer terms the word God, whatever, as Nan just pointed out, seems to be incomprehensible, confusing, threatening, or in some way perplexing to them. So that this term God is almost a catch-all container for various ideas, superstitions, suspicions, and points of confusion. And in order to clear up this confusion, we'd like to invite you to perhaps write to us if you'd like, and we could get our newsletter, the Atheists of Florida newsletter, or we could also send you the truth about atheism, hear it from us, we tell it like it is, and you'll be more than welcome to receive these publications by writing to the addresses at the closing credits of this show. And thank you once again for having been with us, and thank you all for having been here too. Bye-bye.